Hi, friends. Welcome to the session on applying to highly selectives. You will probably hear highly rejectives several times on this session, but we're glad you're here. Our check-in question is, what's something that you find beautiful? Feel free to let us know in the chat if you'd like. We'd love to hear it. I'm Ethan. I'm the college essay guy. You've probably met me before. I use he, him pronouns. I spend a lot of time thinking about college admissions and doing these webinars. Somebody thought that was
Definitely.
funny, so I'm so glad.
So loud.
Um, we'll make sure to mute all, including me, apparently. Um, hi and welcome. And today we're going to be focused broadly on essentially, I'm going to just give you the bullet points that we promised you. What are these highly selectives? Why are so many students interested in attending them? What's new in 2024? What are colleges looking for, broadly speaking? And how are applications read at these selective schools? We've got as our host, who's going to be doing most of the talking and presenting today, Tom, whom you'll meet in just a moment. We've got a little form that we'd love for you to fill out. Alex, our awesome moderator, will put into the chat. It helps us get to know you and what you're interested in. Thanks, Alex, for throwing that in. And we've got a course coming up that Tom's leading on this particular topic on highly selectives that Alex will also share in the chat. With that, Tom, I'm going to kick it over to you for intros and all the things.
Cool. Thanks, Ethan. So hi, everyone. My name is Tom Campbell. I use he, him pronouns. If you came on right at the beginning, you heard me coughing a little bit. I am recovering from, Ethan knows, I'm referring to it as my ailments. I'm having like a lot of random things go wrong with me, from coughs to, I'm not going to bore you with other details. But things look to be on the mend. The sun is shining. I'm feeling glowing. I'm feeling happy to be here and to talk about a topic that I think I get a lot of satisfaction out of, because I used to work in highly selective admissions at Pomona College and College of the Holy Cross, which as of this week's press release is, I would say, a highly selective college, pretty irrefutably. And we have some press release little excerpts to show you all in the spirit of new trends and hot off the press updates. So yeah, my background is in college admissions and college counseling. Spent a total of 6 years on the college admissions end, and then I worked in an independent school in Seattle as well. And I've been at College Essay Guy for almost 2 years now, doing webinars like this, teaching courses, trying to share as much insider knowledge as I've gained of the college admission process, particularly at selective schools, with the masses, with as many people that can benefit from it. So share this recording far and wide. Yes, this session is being recorded, and hopefully you can tune into the course in a few weeks to get even more depth and insight into the highly selective admission process, because this is going to be a pretty rapid fire overview of the process in general. So in terms of our agenda today, this should look familiar if you registered for the session via email. But essentially, we're going to just do a little bit of norming on what a highly selective school is and kind of what I'm referring to when I use that term, because it's not always universally accepted what counts as highly selective. So we'll kind of just go into that for a brief moment. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how the selective admission process has changed in recent years and kind of what has driven a lot of surges in these application pools, what has driven a lot of the hysteria and frenzy around the selective admission process. And we'll also spend some time looking at a few different excerpts and updates from various selective colleges that have released information about their incoming classes this year, just to kind of learn a little bit more about what colleges are saying they're seeing in their applicant pools. And we'll do a little bit of audience participation section in that little middle area as well. Then I'll kind of just go over some best practices around some of the key application components for these highly selective colleges. So courses, recommendation letters, extracurricular activities, and essays, and what are some tips and things to keep in mind and relay to your students and families when you're advising them about those components. And then I'll do a brief walkthrough, time permitting, on how selective admissions officers read applications, particularly a window into what's known as committee-based evaluation. The acronym for that used is CBE, which is a system that many selective colleges and universities use to read as many applications as possible in a quick and efficient way. And then lastly, we'll end things with a little more of the pragmatics, things that students can be doing as they're entering their senior year, especially for guiding high school juniors, as well as some things that you as a counselor can do within your own practice to be able to best advocate for your students. So A lot to get through. And again, the course that is being offered in a few weeks covers a lot more of this information in a lot more depth over a sequence of 3 different sessions for about an hour and a half each. So this is a little teaser, little preview, but hopefully a really good way for you to get a sense of all the things. All right, so what are highly selective schools and why? Oh, I also will mention Ethan is going to be kind of hanging out in the chat during the session. So if you have questions, please do send them along as the session goes along. And Alex and Ethan combined will either be answering them in the chat or we'll be collecting them on a behind the scenes doc for us to answer live towards the end. So questions, go for it. All right, so what are highly selective schools? I like to say that I would, especially when talking with students and families, I would consider a school highly selective if it admits less than 30% of their applicants. Some people might say, wow, I thought it would be a little lower. But in my experience, I would say 30% of a school's overall acceptance rate kind of represents the tipping point, where a school is less concerned with just filling a class and getting people to enroll and attend their college. Colleges that are less selective, that's their main goal, right? Especially as we're approaching this demographic cliff, many people call it, and there are less and less competitive high school age students who are looking at all the 2,800 plus four-year colleges and universities in the United States. Typically, when a school reaches this range, around 30% acceptance rate or less, that's when something called institutional priorities, which I have some slides on in a second, really do become a really proactive and hands-on piece of that particular college's application process. So they're not just looking for students with viable academics who are interested in attending that college and who can pay the price. That's what the majority of colleges and universities in the US are focused on first and foremost. Colleges that have this highly selective application pool, they have the pick of the litter when it comes to students who are in their pool. They can be a little more choosy with students that they are wanting to take in. So they have more heavy-handed directives from their college's leadership, board of trustees, the president, on things that they have to particularly keep an eye out for in their application pool. Highly selective schools also generally practice holistic review. Of course, this does vary from place to place. Not every highly selective school does, but the majority of the 65 or so that have this under 30% acceptance rate that are highly selective do tend to evaluate a broad range of students' experiences when making admissions decisions. So a combination of qualitative, activities and recommendation letter anecdotes, as well as their academic profile, other demographic information about the students is being considered, as well as talents that they bring to the table, etc. They're often seen as one-way tickets to success, but a lot of research and insights have shown that generally colleges that are highly selective tend to really be springboards when it comes to social mobility for those who come from first-generation low income and or low income backgrounds. So that is one thing that these highly selective schools are increasingly known for. And as more of them try to bring in more students who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds, that is something that those are the ones who often benefit the most from attending these places when it comes to job outcomes, name recognition of the school that they go to, a certain cachet in society of being associated with those places. They typically also meet around 100% of demonstrated needs. So again, for low-income students, they're particularly great financial matches. For middle-income students who are looking for maybe more merit-based scholarship aid, not usually as much. Most of these schools don't actually offer a ton of merit scholarship or aid opportunities at all. So that's just something to keep in mind as you counsel students. But overall, again, I want to really underscore, I am not, especially as someone who's worked at highly selective schools, there's a little bit of an irony because I'm not like this huge champion being like, everyone should be applying to these places. I actually don't think that every student should be. I don't think that they're great matches for every student. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir since this is a majority counselor session. But again, these schools represent about 2% of US colleges. The students who go to the Ivy Plus, which are the most 11 highly selective schools out there. So the Ivy League schools plus MIT, Caltech, Stanford, Northwestern, Chicago, I believe. They represent 0.5% of the US high school graduating population. So again, this is a crisis of the 95%. And I know many of you are working with students and families who are interested in these schools, maybe wanting to put their hat in the ring at these schools and not quite sure how to put their best foot forward. So that's the whole point of this session, because by and large, when we polled our audience about what they need the most support with, both counselors, students, and families across the board have said that this is the area of the admission process they want more insights on. So that's why we're here. Okay, and what highly selective schools also are, and again, kind of the other side of the coin, maybe we're starting with counting up moments, as we say at College as a Guide. These are some counting down moments with highly selective schools. So, as we know right now, something that Ethan actually will be presenting, I don't know if this is like public knowledge, but we'll be doing more stuff around mental health and how to support students who are struggling with mental health with their high school experience. And Gen Z, as a lot of research has shown, is really struggling with a lot of areas around academic pressure, uncertainties of the future, and are a lot more of a vocal generation about struggling with various mental health challenges. So highly selective schools actually do tend to struggle just statistically with supporting students in this area. They continue to struggle, creating equitable opportunities for disadvantaged students. Colleges in I'd say the past recent, 2 decades or so have definitely made lots of strides in trying to be more open with their doors to students who haven't always had a seat at the table at these places. But we can still continue to experience challenges with that, especially when there are certain policies that come into play outside of an individual college's control, such as the Supreme Court ruling that has highly impacted on race-conscious admission, that have highly impacted these highly selective schools in particular. And then, this again may not be super new to a lot of US counselors, but a book that I found very enlightening, especially after having worked at these institutions, it's called Excellent Sheep. And the book really kind of goes and underscores a lot of kind of the pain points of these college campuses and some of the trends and dynamics around students related to associating their identity around, achieving trophies and doing the right thing and crossing things off a list. And so, faculty at these schools have voiced that there are concerns around, an increasing generation of students who are kind of looking at life as a series of hoops to jump through and check boxes to check. So yes, no institution is perfect. There are pros and cons to these places, but kind of having that information and being able to share it with your students and families is hopefully helpful in your practice. So a term that I mentioned before earlier on the first slide is something called institutional priorities, right? So this, if you're a counselor, again, this is beyond the basics. So you may or may not have heard that term before. We have lots of counselors who come to CEG with a wide range of experiences and work at different schools. So what this term refers to are these directives, right? These beyond just admitting students who are academically viable and have, who have been involved in their communities. That's kind of a given in these highly selective application pools. At these schools that are highly selective, many more of them are going to be taking into consideration things like what you see here on the screen in varying degrees. So every college has different institutional priorities that are set by an individual college's leadership. They are not consistent across these highly selective colleges. That is a real challenge for students and families and counselors in understanding or trying to figure out how to advocate for students. There are some recommendations that I have towards the ends of the presentation on how to do that. But in general, the things that you see here on the screen, so whether or not a family can pay and potentially donate lots of money to a school, that's something that might, bump a student's chances up at a certain individual, highly selective college. Maybe the student has an uncommon extra or academic interest that's less common in the college's application pool, and the college's leadership is really pressuring the admission team to hold the line with certain high demand majors and programs. That's increasingly becoming a really big trend in the highly selective admission landscape, are these program-based distinctions when it comes to acceptance rates and proactivity for students who are pursuing less common majors. They have a little bit of a bump at a lot of these places. Some schools care a lot about geographic diversity and having students from all 50 states, or really bolstering student enrollment from certain regions. And sometimes there's really arbitrary reasons behind that. I remember even at Holy Cross, the president while I was there was from the Pacific Northwest. So he had like a sentimental attachment to that region and like wanted there to be, more students who are coming in from schools in that area. So I made sure as the regional rep from that area to go and visit more schools, particularly Catholic schools, where there was more of a likelihood that they would look at a school named Holy Cross to try and bolster recruitment there. So sometimes the reasons behind why colleges have these priorities are very arbitrary and niche. Other times they're pretty consistent across just what a lot of these colleges are seeing in their application pools with trends more broadly and preferences among students and families. And it's supply and demand, right? The more rare students have certain attributes or talents or interests, typically the more those students are going to be attractive to these selective colleges when they look different than the rest of the application pool in various capacities. Again, these are great talking points and things to relate to your families. And just for you to know as well, is that a lot of times these priorities are completely out of control for students and families. You can theoretically move to West Virginia when you are a 10th grader and, graduate in high school from that particular state. There are families and students who have done things, what I would say are more extreme ways to stand out to various colleges. But for the most part, uprooting a family and kind of really your trajectory as a high school student is A, not a student-centered practice, and B, not practical. These priorities are often also not very public knowledge as well. So that's something else to keep in mind. As I've mentioned before, they vary in terms of importance and weight from college to college, which presents a big challenge for you as a counselor to know, how much being a male student at a particular college is a bump in their application pool. How much is that school trying to have gender balance as a part of their incoming class? These are questions that are not always as publicly available, depending on how transparent a college is with these more behind the scenes things. And again, of course, these don't define students, right? I think one thing that one of our college counselors, Adrian Spraggins, recently mentioned on a webinar is that your admissions decision is not a decision on you, it's a decision on your application. And I thought that was a really good line and way to communicate to students that it is not personal. It definitely doesn't feel that way, especially as I know many of you are counseling students who are getting news right around this week or next. But it truly is a marker of their application and the components, and not necessarily a marker on their talent, drive, initiative, and their values. So how has the process changed in recent years? Again, the highly selective course goes into a lot more detail about a lot of these points, current events, trends in the profession. But just to kind of give you a macro level overview, I'd say in the past 10 years or so, a lot of the things that you see on the left side of the screen are contributing to these big application pools, these shrinking acceptance rates, and this increased frenzy and hysteria around a lot of populations who are looking and clamoring at the gates to try and attend these elite schools. Overall, there are more and more students, and there's a lot of increasing skepticism among Gen Z and different student populations around the value of a college degree. But in general, these highly selective schools are a little more immune from some of these broader trends around higher education because they still hold a lot of the power. They have the national consciousness. They're the schools that are constantly mentioned in headlines and news articles, which creates a challenge when, again, as we know from the previous slides, they only represent 2% of US colleges. The Ivy Plus only represent 0.5% of US high school graduates. But this increase in the overall college application in the past 10, 20 years, across the board, across various different subpopulations, demographics, is increasing the competition for spots at these colleges, right? They have not grown to match the demand and the heightened application pools, both domestically and internationally. Colleges are not adding a ton of new dorms. They're not expanding a lot of their programs. So especially these more elite schools, they're kind of staying around the same size, and the application pools just keep growing, right? That common application has made it a lot easier for students to apply to multiple schools. That has definitely contributed to this surge. The rise of just like the term enrollment management and tactics that different schools have used. One school that's pretty, I don't want to say infamous, but pretty well known for really launching, and there's a slide to kind of communicate this, launching into a new springboard of selectivity, although they've been a highly ranked school for a very long time, is University of Chicago, right? Because of a lot of marketing work, work strategically from the enrollment management side, their acceptance rate has plummeted now to being one of these most highly selective schools, very akin or similar to most of the Ivy League schools. But it wasn't that way 10, 20 years ago, even though they were still very competitive or still very much known for academic quality. And as we know, as counselors, quality does not associate with selectivity, but public perception doesn't see that or manifest that thought all the time. So enrollment management leaders, to stay competitive in this marketplace with colleges, they want to have a lot of applications. For the most part, there are some schools that are making some changes to their process that are a little surprising because they will inevitably decrease their applications. Spoiler alert. But in general, enrollment management as a profession and an idea, things like early decision, those have kind of really come into rise in the past 10 years. That's contributing a lot to more competition at these schools. And then things on the right side are a little more current events the past 5 years or so, things like the pandemic impacting learning loss, students' ability to take standardized tests, students' abilities to continue their consistent extracurricular activities and engagements as they would as typical high school students. And of course, the longstanding impacts of COVID and the pandemic on health and wellness, identity, student development. Those are definitely things that colleges are continuing to wrestle with, and you as high school advocates as well, something that you continue to think through. The SCOTUS decision on race-conscious admission. So as of this year, right, this is the first application cycle where colleges are not going to be able to use race or ethnicity as a part of the admission decision making process and workflow for students, purely as a data point. Students are able to write about their lived experience, including their racial identity, in their essays, and counselors are also welcome, and according to guidance from the Biden administration, a joint statement from the Justice Department, as well as the Education Department, guidance counselors, college counselors as well, are able to speak, especially if a student has disclosed it to them, about a student's racial lived experience or identity in recommendation letters, in other forms of advocacy in the application, particularly how that, if and how that student's identity has shaped their values, qualities, interests, etc. The standardized testing landscape, we can definitely talk more about this towards the end of the session, because I want to make sure to get all the macro level details in more depth. But I know many of you probably have questions around this landscape and how there are, little shockwaves and splashes, I'm sure, in many of your communities around several schools such as University of Texas, Austin, Dartmouth, Brown, Yale, reintroducing standardized testing, MIT, reintroducing testing as part of their admission process. I think it's really important to underscore that these still represent a very, very significant minority of even highly selective colleges. So it's important to really communicate to students and families that I would not anticipate, and most experts also as well, most research is really signaling that it's this tidal wave of schools going back to testing next cycle is very, very unlikely. So it's still very possible for students to be able to have a very prestige heavy and, in their eyes, selective college list without standardized testing being this end all be all. Of course, that depends on the state that a student is coming from, right? For states that have enacted or reintroduced standardized testing for their flagship system, that becomes a little more tricky to not have testing maybe be as heavy-handed in part of the student's prep. But in general, it's still very, 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 very probable and possible right now for a student to have a college list exclusively as test optional or test free / test blind schools. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then, of course, there's, on the other side of the coin, especially in contrast to the race conscious admission decision, many highly selective schools are pursuing or considering changes to legacy admission policies. Schools like Amherst College that have recently enacted these in the past 2 years saw their overall legacy pool go from about 12% of the incoming student body to 6%, so about half. So more and more schools and states are considering enacting policies barring legacy admission because of the overwhelming data that it supports overwhelmingly white and wealthy students across the board from a demographic standpoint. And then artificial intelligence. We could get a lot into this, but many colleges are also rethinking their admission processes, policies, procedures, required elements because of the rise of AI, things like ChatGPT impacting students' essays and work. So Ethan and myself can definitely talk about this towards the end if you have specific questions, but for the sake of time, we're gonna keep rolling. Okay, so this is just a helpful slide, and it's a little dated, sorry that it's from 2019, but it's a really helpful visual to be able to communicate to students and families that, like, this is not your mama's highly selective landscape, is kind of the phrase that I use, right? Because a lot of times, especially if parents are stepping into this process and they don't have older siblings or they don't have older children who have recently gone through it in the past year or two, it can be really surprising to many students and families, particularly parents, around what actually counts as a highly selective school in today's day and age. So this may not be surprising to all of you seeing this, but I think it's pretty surprising seeing some of the schools, again, like University of Chicago, like Vanderbilt, like Johns Hopkins, and kind of seeing it's a little harder with the colors that are on here because I'm like, there's lots of yellows and there's lots of oranges, but hopefully you can parse out which schools are which here in terms of the plummeting acceptance rates to really kind of underscore that, again, in the past 10, 15 years, the schools that families would associate kind of being backups to the Ivies are not really the reality. They're all kind of around the same around 10% or less acceptance rate at this point. So for people kind of putting together a list and thinking, oh, I'm not going to apply ED to an Ivy because it's too hard, but I'll apply ED to Northwestern and it'll be easier for me to get in. Not necessarily. There's a lot of nuance to that decision. And then a little similar here, but I think what the big takeaways and learning opportunities from this particular chart, which shows the largest declines in acceptance rate, should be, 2006 to 2019, little typo. But you're seeing, especially with schools like Georgia Tech, places like BU, those kind of top two lines that went from, in 2006, 60+% acceptance rate to a now, 20% or lower. You're seeing these kind of more fixed preferences for students around STEM, bigger schools, and urban schools. I joke that like students would often come to me saying like, I want a medium-sized school that's really prestigious in a city. And I'm like, okay, well, that's the Ivies and Jesuit colleges and universities. And they're like, I've never heard of these Jesuit schools, so guess it's the Ivies only for me. I'm like, well, good luck with that. It's going to work out, I'm sure, great for you. So again, as we're counseling students and families, I think being aware that in terms of supply and demand, the majority of students and families are targeting schools with highly selective, STEM programs, larger schools that have more urban access. And depending on the individual student and family, these may be really, really top for lots of cultural context factors, for proximity to home factors. If every student has a different reason why schools are on their list. But I would say in general, for those of you who are advocating for students who want a name and a school that is selective, looking at maybe some of those smaller schools that maybe are not right in a city, may give students and families the name that excites them, the acceptance rate that excites them, but not quite the highest degree of competition because of these trends overall in the landscape, right? So kind of switching gears to more timely pieces of information that are literally hot off the press, release. These are some recent revelations or insights from various colleges and universities that are considered highly selective on their various application pools. Across the board for the schools that have released decisions in the past week or two, there still continues to be a increase in number of schools that are having larger application pools. So I think I was able to pull together 6 or so different press releases / counselor notifications from various colleges and universities. And the only school that had a decrease in applications was Swarthmore College, but not by a huge margin. Overall, still definitely a very, very highly selective school. Places like Holy Cross, again, this is, for counselors, this might be a little surprising, even for me as a former staff member. When I was there, the acceptance rate was hovering, consistently each year between 30 to 40% overall. So to see the school really kind of slash that rate in half, and cite, new programs like partnerships with Questbridge, that's new as of last year's incoming first-year class at Holy Cross. Holy Cross is a very heavy early decision-based school. It's just another reminder again as counselors that it's important to be up to date on current schools' updated processes, because even data from 2 or 3 years ago doesn't necessarily reflect the level of competition that students might be facing. In your school might be, oh, this is always the target school that I'm going to put on a student's list. Things are changing really rapidly, right? So I think it's important to make sure to be keeping an eye out on these press releases and notices that colleges send out, because I wouldn't necessarily say Holy Cross is now a target school unless you're applying early decision for a lot of high achieving students. UCLA, right? The fact that they have in this data here, over 20% of students apply with straight A's, I think it underscored two big forms of grade inflation in lots of different high schools and maybe pandemic era grading trends. But again, UCLA continues to be the school in the US with the largest application pool by far, in the hundreds of thousands. And that is the largest that has ever been. Tulane making some changes in their admission process. Again, another name of a school that has really ramped up selectivity in recent years, but they've made some surprising shifts in scaling back from early decision, whereas a lot of schools are continuing to maintain that 50% or more of students who are applying through early decision. Duke, record application year for them, so record low early decision acceptance rate, and anticipating a record low regular decision acceptance rate as well. So it's like, I'm going through the slides. I'm like, things are looking great, aren't they? Just so optimistic. Bucknell, another school that, isn't always associated, I'd say, with being highly selective. Times are changing, right? So Bucknell, a lot of their programs have acceptance rates of below 20%, particularly programs like computer science, programs out of their School of Management. And Bucknell, kudos to them for being very transparent. And they actually wrote in their email, so your advocacy as counselors does matter. Some schools do listen and give you what you're looking for. They actually parsed out in their email a chart of different acceptance rates for different programs and colleges. So they have, among some of their popular majors, differing acceptance rates from program to program. One thing that I wanted to note here that I thought was interesting of Bucknell to note and kind of put there as a planting of the seed to counselors is noting that in this particular cycle, they noticed a lot more students with less math preparation than they typically are comfortable admitting. So that's something in terms of counseling students, right? Colleges are vocalizing that maybe some changes depending on your school district or individual school policy related to math preparation. A lot of times this is a result of the pandemic. It is the time now, I'd say, where colleges are wanting to see a consistent math preparation as they have seen years prior in order to give security to the faculty in their various departments, particularly STEM heavy departments or things like economics or business, as Bucknell is noting, to have that strong math preparation and make sure to be proactive about students choosing their classes that way. Okay. So this is actually where I'm going to switch gears for a little more audience participation, because I think this is a kind of a fun little exercise. So one thing that Pomona, where I used to work, they also just announced their incoming first year class on Friday. And as you can see, many colleges and universities are noting increased partnerships with various community-based organizations that particularly support first generation and or low income students, which oftentimes statistically are also underrepresented students of color. That's been a way that a lot of highly selective colleges and universities have been able to try and bolster their recruitment efforts to have a larger pool of underrepresented students of color who are applying to their various colleges and universities. And Pomona is definitely kind of noting that of their 800 or so admitted students, 116 of them are affiliated with a community-based organization, and about 26% identify as first generation to college. So again, colleges are using race-neutral strategies to try and bring in as diverse of a class as possible with this current Supreme Court ruling impacting their affirmative action policies. So this, I'm going to have you spend a couple minutes just reading through these excerpts. I thought what Pomona did was very interesting and smart in profiling specific students who were admitted to the college and giving you a little bit of a sense of why. So I want you to take a look at, there's two students who are here on the screen. And I'm going to show you two others. The press release covered 4 individual students and gave a little excerpt of, things that, according to Pomona, are standout experiences, interests, accolades, traits that, they are proud enough to champion and celebrate in a press release. So I'll have you go and take a few minutes to just read these 2 samples here, and then I'll move to the next slide. And I'd love to hear in the comments from people if there's anything you're noticing about the examples that they chose. As someone who worked there, I feel like I kind of had a sense of why, but I'm curious to see if you notice things from what's in here. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next one.
Tom, one person asked, when you say press release, do you mean emails from the colleges directly? Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so this specifically is a press release on Pomona's website. So a lot of colleges will send counselor communications to individual counselor listservs. If you have students who've applied to your school through Naviance Score, a lot of times your information is sent to a college. So you'll get emails, but also this is specifically for Pomona from the press release on the college's website. So in looking at these 4 samples, would love to see in the comments if there's anything, and Ethan, you can feel free to chime in and synthesize if you're seeing anything that people are noticing of the profiled students.
Will do.
Anything coming up?
It's a range.
Okay.
We've got interdisciplinary angle, helping others.
Yeah.
Community engagement, fit to major.
Yeah.
Interdisciplinary.
I think that that word really, it's a nail on the head. And I mean, this is Pomona specifically, right? So again, as I mentioned before, one college's institutional priorities is not necessarily dictating all highly selective colleges. But I would argue in general, we're in an era where a lot of students are communicating a very similar narrative about goals, right? If you think about a STEM student that you're working with, I want to work in computer science and work in tech. What else? Anything else that you are wanting to do in that space? Are there particular populations you are wanting to innovate technologies or challenges in society you want to address? A lot of times students who are applying to these schools, they think just by having the course load and interest and internship or exploring the school or a major on a podcast is kind of leveling up their intellectual curiosity to a interesting level. But I would argue that the students that Pomona is highlighting, the common themes that you're seeing with them is that they have an interesting combination of things that they're hoping to fuse together to solve pressing societal challenges. That is, I'd say, a common theme that you're seeing across all 4 students that were profiled. And it's something that I'd say increasingly when students are able to communicate that they have a cause, a population. One example that I often used to give when I worked at Pomona was we had a series of alumni profiles. And one of them was a woman named, I'm blanking on her name, but she was an Africana Studies major at Pomona, and she wanted to go into medicine because she's from Oakland, California. She identifies as a Black woman. She was like, hey, I know firsthand from my lived experience as well as my educational background now, the disparities that exist in my community. And I want to go and work as a doctor, particularly with a lens on how to help Black individuals advocate for themselves in the healthcare sphere. That is an example of a student with a very clear motivation and goal that they're working towards. And I would say increasingly at these highly selective schools, there are some, let's say, maybe more liberal arts colleges, some of them, where being kind of that more well-rounded exploratory student is fine. Being undecided is okay. But I would say there's a longer list of those highly selective schools that are wanting to see students with a little more of a clearer motivation and action steps that demonstrate initiative and impact towards ideally some kind of cause that is motivating and sparking their intellectual curiosity. This is something that Pomona is specifically noting about their process, but I would also say when working with students, these are the types of profiles or things and messages to communicate to students and families. It's not just enough to be a captain of a sports team. It's not just enough to think that math is really cool. Oftentimes these colleges have valued qualities that are in their press releases, strategic plans. Ethan and myself are actually going through a very in-depth data analysis / collecting a bunch of different press releases, mission statements, etc., to try and have a little more of a synthesis and findings around common valued qualities, interests, things that colleges are saying they're wanting more of in students. And I would say a consciousness for changing society for the better, for living out values, for approaching innovative solutions and ideas for how to address a challenge that they're seeing firsthand in their community, or maybe a community that they feel connected to, are definitely commonalities that you're going to see among students who, regardless of if they have a hook or institutional priority or not, that's something that I think you're going to see in more and more students. And more students who are competitive at these schools without as much of a recruited athlete nudge or a legacy connection, etc. So in general, in the theme of trying to advocate for students and give them the best foot forward to make their application competitive, what are the types of courses, essays, recommendation letters, and extracurricular activities that highly selective schools prefer? So this slide here, which for me, okay, now it loaded. This is something that Ethan and myself have actually been doing a whole podcast series all about the different components in the holistic review of a typical college application at these more selective colleges. So as you can see here from this chart, this is a release from NACAC, the National Association for College Admission Counseling, and it kind of goes into the most important factors in a various colleges admissions decision process. So we're going to go in order of this. So we're going to start with grades and courses, and we're going to go to essays, recommendations, and then activities in terms of things to recommend to students or for yourself as the author of recommendations, etc. So this is I'm going to go through this really quickly. A lot of times there's a lot of but, if, and qualifiers that counselors will ask. So definitely feel free to put those in the chat. I'm happy to answer as many questions as possible related to course selection. But the general rule of thumb, and this is really, really across the board at, again, the 65-ish highly selective schools that are out there, is that taking all 5 solid academic courses that you see here on the screen, all 4 years, is going to provide you with the highest mathematical chance of being accepted in the foot in the door when, most of these colleges say that about 70 to 80% of their academic pool, their pool is academically admissible, purely based on the courses that they've chosen, the grades they've received in those courses, and other academic factors. So if your student is not doing this, they're part of the 20 to 30% who are being deemed non-academically viable. And it's much harder for an admissions officer to make a case for a student when they don't have all 4 years of a history or don't have all 4 years of a science, even if they're not necessarily planning on going to that major or program. Students and families often don't like to hear this. A lot of times students, especially if they're like, oh, I'm really into STEM, I want to drop out because my graduation requirements are 3 years of history. I don't want to do it anymore. Interestingly enough, I actually went ahead and looked at the listed recommended courses based on the Ivy Plus's website. And I was really shocked to find out that actually more of them recommend 4 years of language, which is often the course that lots of students want to drop, than even history or social studies. I would still argue that you still mathematically, right? You still don't want to be part of the number of students who don't have the 4 years. And this is also only a smattering of 11 or so schools that are considered highly selective. If students are not taking these courses all 4 years, or a combination of 4 years total, so if you double up in science as a junior so that you have room to take other things as a senior, that's fine, as long as there's a collective 4 years of a particular subject. And of course, the other piece here is increasing levels of rigor. That's a loaded word, but levels of advanced courses within an individual high school. That is also something that a highly selective college is going to want to see. From my experience, and I'm just being very candid here, sometimes people ask, well, is it fine to just have a lot of honors courses, but not as many APs if the high school offers it? I would argue if you are targeting highly selective schools, they're going to go right towards that AP list when they're looking at a school profile in terms of what a high school offers. And the question they're asking themselves is, what did the student leave on the table? So this is an area where, again, students going to be surprised, or they don't always like to hear that, their senior year, maybe they want to have a little more freedom and flexibility. I often encourage students that college is the time to have freedom and explore and dabble between literally hundreds of courses, way more offerings than what they have in high school, and really nailing the foundations and the basics, quote unquote. I mean, not necessarily the basics, but the core academic areas is really going to be the thing to help put their best foot forward. Essays, I'm going to go into this really quickly because we're a college essay guy and we have literally articles, resources, YouTube video, so much on essays. But in general, highly selective colleges definitely do want to see, 4 key things when it comes to a student's essay. They want to see a student's values and what drives them. They want to see insight moments. So instead of just saying, I went here, I did this, I did that, and this is the end of the story, what did you learn along the steps of your journey? What were the aha moments, the revelations, the epiphanies that your life experience has helped you come to? Oftentimes including those, less of the play-by-play and more of the introspective, like, these experiences made me realize that I actually really do value family a lot more than I thought. That would be an example of an insight coming from a particular cause and effect scenario in a student's essay. Vulnerability, and these are what we call the 4 qualities of the Great College Essay Test. So as long as I'd say a personal statement has some combination of these 4 traits, these typically tend to be the 4 buckets that a person who's reading essays is going to want to be seeing in some way, shape, or form. It's very possible to write a great college essay that makes a student competitive at highly selective colleges that doesn't have a ton of vulnerability in it. But from my experience, from Ethan's experience, from others who work in this space, definitely when students are able to let their guard down a little bit and reveal some things about themselves that aren't necessarily letter perfect, that does tend to be something that allows a reader to build a connection with a student. And then craft. This is an area where students are often, I'd say, a little overly optimistic, or they think that they have to be this wordsmith Shakespeare to write a great essay, but that's not the case. It really just has to be coherent, well-written, and able for someone reading through it very quickly to get a sense of what it is. Supplemental essays. So again, going through this really quickly, I have tons of guides on how to write these, but these are typically the majority of the ones that highly selective schools are looking for. They really want students to get specific, right, with the why us essays. And that's on my action items for students. It's research colleges better. that's got to be the top of the list, because increasingly with the students I'm working with, it's like tooth and nail to try and get them to give me any specific details about why a school is on their list. And I mean, it seems like low-hanging fruit, but I'll just tell you it's not. That really does make a difference when students get a certain level of specificity, but programs, majors, interests, things about a college that attracts them, especially when they're coming from primary sources, students that they talk to, blogs that they read that the college provided, social media posts, or a story takeover from a student. If a student's able to kind of communicate some of these things that they've been able to do in terms of their research and learning about a school more intentionally, they're setting themselves far, far ahead for success when it comes to these essays. Again, kind of similar to what I said before about insight, with extracurricular essays, it's less about just writing about why you did, but really folding in that why it matters and the overall so what behind it. And then many colleges, of course, and universities right now are looking to see what students are bringing when it comes to their lived experiences and community attributes. My tip for you as counselors is that a lot of colleges, right, they introduce these prompts because of the Supreme Court ruling on race-conscious admission to give students an opportunity to write about lived experience, however that takes shape for them. I would say colleges, they probably are putting this as an umbrella term to be more broad, but in general, writing about, for example, a role like I'm the president of a particular club is not necessarily, I'd say, the angle to take with these essays. I would not recommend that over across the board. Some students, that's really what they want to write about. It's fine. But in general, I would say working with students to maybe think about like their sibling order, anything kind of like regardless of kind of like their comfort level with their own identity and their exploration with that. It's very fluid, it's very evolving. But in general, I'd say just sticking to like their identity as their sport or their club or whatnot is not really giving the juice of like where a student's coming from. So if a student's coming from the Bay Area, I would, really welcome an essay about kind of the academic pressure of living there and what that's been like for the student. That's an example of maybe in these highly selective application pools, a more common lived experience. There's a lot of high achieving students who are applying from the Bay Area and California, but colleges would rather read about that than you being captain of the robotics team for a diversity and community prompt. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly for the sake of time, but just in general, with recommendation letters, I'd say a good kind of distinction between guiding yourself and your teaching staff at your school is that the counselor letter is like a synthesis of a bunch of different areas of a student. So you're kind of like the secondary source. You're compiling testimonials from parents, from the junior questionnaire, from student comments, from whatever source material you have. I also want to put out the caveat that colleges read everything in context, right? So if you are coming from a school where you don't have time or capacity to write detailed letters about students on your caseload, they completely understand that and take that into consideration when they're reading applications. Even Mercer Island High School, where I used to read files in Washington State, it's a very wealthy zip code. It's where a lot of Microsoft families in Seattle have their kids go to the public school there. They don't send counselor letters for any of their students, from my knowledge, at least in most recent years. So even a school that's high achieving, affluent, highly resourced, they don't even have letters of rec from counselors for their students. It's a school policy. So, and those students are still being admitted across the board to lots of highly selective schools. And the teacher letters are where that insight is coming into the fold. And the teacher insight, ideally, I'd say, is kind of thinking of it more as a primary source. So encouraging when you're making that distinction and teachers don't always like to hear how to do things, but in terms of kind of giving a framework for like who's doing what, this is a good kind of like trio of like, all right, the school support that a student is getting in the admission process. The school profile is the where a student goes to school, what courses are offered, what the local community is like, what the college going culture is like. The counselor letter is who the student is. So particular challenges the student has gone through, notable contrast between that student and the broader community that the admissions officer got to learn about in the school profile. Teacher letters, that's a little more zoomed in. It's what has the actual teacher witnessed about that student in class? Have they been the bridge builder, connecting different students and being a really great group project leader? Have they been the one who's giving like these mic drop insights and they're usually more quiet, but when they speak, it's really profound. These are all things that, again, are really helpful to someone making admissions decisions to have a little bit more layers of advocacy for a student and not just have it be repeating the same resume over and over again. For activities, I would say that in general, students who are applying to highly selective schools and are more competitive are thinking beyond the walls of their own high school. So again, being captain of or president of NHS and captain of a sport, those are common extracurricular profiles and backgrounds of students who are applying to these highly selective schools. So activities that often have a self-directed component to them, activities that often have an intellectual curiosity lean to them, and just ones that are original and interesting tend to be interesting to colleges. But again, on that list of the NACAC report, I would say extracurricular activities are one where students and families overemphasize their role, thinking that they need to shell out tons of money for pay-to-play research programs, things like that. I do not recommend that. I don't think that that is something that you need to be pushing students and families to do to be competitive. And there are actually, these are all examples of students, the majority of whom were low-income students, whose files I read over the years, both or help students apply from either the independent school side or reading applications at Pomona and Holy Cross. These are examples of things that students did that stood out from an extracurricular standpoint. And the majority of these were either free or low cost opportunities or initiatives that the students took on. And I like to use this as an example to say, you don't need to be paying for a snazzy, shiny research project, because those actually kind of become a little, it's kind of obvious and kind of, I'd say, lessens the oomph and the drive of the student kind of really taking the reins and doing something themselves, which is typically, I'd say, something that stands out more to a selective admissions officer. I don't think we're going to have a ton of time to go into this because we're running short, but in general, how do admissions officers actually read applications? It's through, at a lot of these selective colleges, it's through a process called committee-based evaluation. I think my slide is a little frozen, but essentially what this process looks like is when an admissions officer, so say me, or used to, is reading applications from a particular geographic territory, I'm responsible for knowing the curriculum offerings, the dynamics, the trends when it comes to education for a particular state or region. So let's use Washington State as an example. For committee-based evaluation at the selective college, if you are in the reading process that you see here in the second phase of a reading process for a school, a driver of a file, typically committee-based evaluation is two people reading the same file at the same time, but focusing on different components. So for committee-based evaluation, a driver would be someone who is responsible for the academic components primarily, so knowing the curriculum offerings types that a college has. And then the passenger is going to be like a celebrity guest. It's another member of the admission team who is responsible primarily for another geographic area, who is going to kind of give their opinion on the file more broadly, especially the more qualitative things. What's standing out in the essays? Is there evidence for institutional priorities anywhere that I'm finding? Things like that. And then the two individuals are having a dialogue about that and pulling quotes, recommendations, highlighting maybe if the college uses a rubric that has valued qualities that they're keeping an eye out for. Many colleges do have things like that, non-quantitative factors that they're trying to source out from the student's application material based on their own mission statements, values, core values, things like that. Those are things that the driver and the passenger are going to collectively be synthesizing. And then the driver, by the time the file gets to a broader committee conversation with more and more faces in the room and more seats at the table, they're presenting a case for why that student should be admitted with highlights, with quotes, with rationales of the priorities that the student meets, of course, the academic threshold that they cross over, and then other things that stand out to the individual admissions officer. They have to be rooted oftentimes in these priorities, and it can't just be, this kid's cool because they juggle while surfing. That's not typically at most colleges an institutional priority. That's a cool thing. It makes them interesting and stand out, but it wouldn't make up for example, a student coming from, a really common state in the pool, wanting a really common major with a really similar extracurricular profile outside the juggling, maybe a really common gender in that college's application pool. Those are all things that are working against even the most distinctive or sexy, avant-garde qualities that a student has in a highly selective school. All right, this is actually the last section, so I'm kind of proud of kind of zipping through a lot of this material. And I'm happy to stay a few more minutes as well for questions that I know Ethan's been covering a lot in the chat. But what can juniors do in terms of action steps for improving their chances at these schools? So this slide is really important because I think it provides, I'd say, the biggest recommendations of things that I start to notice students neglecting and families neglecting as they start to embark their college search process. So the first thing is to maintain that consistently high academic engagement and or improve and build off of what they've previously done from 9th through 11th grade. So as a senior, encouraging them to maintain their grades and their academic profile. Students who slip when it comes to their grades as seniors, a lot of times, especially if they're applying regular decision, colleges ask for mid-year reports. So they have usually a first semester of a student's senior grades. And even a lot of schools that ask for early decision, have early decision policies, will ask for a student's first quarter grades or first trimester, or some kind of progress report, right? So they want to see those core solid courses. They want to see that consistently high academic engagement. So first things first, making sure to keep that a priority, to make sure that you're getting the foot in the door at these schools. Demonstrating interest. So most highly selective schools actually don't really heavily emphasize demonstrated interest. It varies from college to college, as with a lot of these things. And what you want to do is demonstrate interest strategically and intentionally. So with students, I'd say having them keep a spreadsheet or a log, or using Score or Naviance, whatever platform you use, really kind of encouraging them to keep track from a college's common data set of what their level of applicants' interests, section C7 in the report. It will show you what a college, how they measure demonstrated interest, if it's something that they discuss as part of a student's candidacy. But I will say, as someone who worked for a college, Pomona, that didn't measure demonstrated interest, I met kids at college fairs. I met kids on the road, people who come meet with me on tours. I was more likely to want to advocate for kids that kind of showed me that they know the school. They really are excited about it. I remember one particular student, her name's Katie Stewart. She's a current star tour guide at Pomona. She went to a coffee shop session I did as a 10th grader with her mom. She did all the programs and virtual opportunities that we had at Pomona, and her application, I remember it came forward in committee and everyone was like, this is like the perfect Pomona application. It's so good. And she listened to all the advice that we gave. She tuned into all the things that we put on. So for students who are like, I want to know what colleges want, they put on programming. Some are, I'd say, more open than others, but even though demonstrated interest wasn't considered, that's not the reason she was admitted. It allowed her to put together an awesome application and made me want to advocate for her more. So demonstrated interest is something that doesn't really hurt a student. And you want to be smart about it and prioritize the schools where it makes a difference, but not actually have it be the end all be all, because again, at highly selective schools, you really want to focus on those target schools. Yeah.
Before we're at the hour, I want to make sure we get a chance to talk a little bit about the course coming up. And quick note, we're going to put a link in the chat for the course. We're going to give away, I approved this, Devin approved this, Tom. We're going to give away a free enrollment to this course for the 10th person who signs up. So caller 10, you win a free, so you have to sign up for the course, but the 10th person to sign up will get into the course for free. We'll just like refund you all your money. So Tom, tell folks about the course a little bit, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Yeah. So these action steps and many more included in a lot more depth in the course. You have a lot more time to ask maybe more nuanced questions about your own process. I answer every question too for the courses, like on a behind the scenes doc, and share those out before the next one. So yeah, it's a good time. There's also these resources that are included in it. But just to give you a kind of broad overview of the course and kind of what it entails, the helping students apply to highly selective course. It is a pay what you can course. So again, at College SAI, we're really big on access. We have counselors who are coming from across the board, schools with varying financial resources. So that policy is a way for you to be able to get this information and in-depth experience, but in a way that's as cost-effective as possible for your budget. So the course kind of moves through three different sequences, kind of similar to this presentation, actually. The first section will kind of go a lot more into what it takes to be admitted to a highly selective school. We'll do a lot more of a deep dive into trends in the highly selective landscape, a lot more looking at data. We'll also I have data and kind of talking points around alternate pathways to highly selective schools to help your students balance out their college list. So that's something that the first section of the course really has a heightened emphasis on, is managing expectations with students and families when it comes to this landscape. The middle part is a little more about the actual application components and diving into more depth on some of the things that I mentioned today about essays, course recommendations, recommendation letters, activities, things along those lines. And then I also do a more thorough and deep dive walkthrough on the selective admission reading process and the different steps and phases that an individual admissions officer will go behind the scenes as part of their job in making decisions on students. The last one I'd say is the one when we did the course last year that got the best feedback and was the most, I think, helpful for for wrapping things all together and kind of putting all the pieces into motion. And it's a case study. So for many of you on the high school side, you may operate case studies in your own high school where there's different college profiles that you're sharing. So we put them together based on students that we've worked with at College Essay Guy, our team, various essay coaches, college counselors. And so these are files of actual students who applied to highly selective colleges. And it's meant to kind of be a simulation on actually working for an individual college, having to keep institutional priorities in mind, having to craft an argument as to why students should be admitted. And you're welcome to, again, use these case studies and files after attending the course with your students and families to really help hone in and solidify the teaching moments of what it means to work in highly selective admissions and be competitive. So that's the course in 30 seconds.
Awesome. Amanda's asking, do we have pay what you can spots for students? We've got a whole separate course for students. We're doing a webinar this afternoon in 5 hours that students and even parents sometimes sign up for. So we've got pay what you can spots there. So we'll share the link one more time for anybody who's interested. Alex, thanks for sharing that out. And we will follow up with the person because I don't have access to the behind the scenes to see who the 10th caller was, who the 10th person to sign up was. But we're going to hang out here for a few minutes and do some more Q&A. Maybe we'll spend 7 minutes or so answering some more questions, some really great ones. And we won't, unfortunately, get to all of them, but I want to highlight a couple.
Sure.
One of the big ones that came up, a few folks asked about how colleges evaluate things, Tom, like AP versus dual enrollment versus, IB. So, how do selective colleges view those? We can probably even stop sharing the screen just so we can see your lovely.
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to keep this one up because I didn't actually talk through this slide. So if people don't care about this question and want to read what's on here, these are my biggest recommendations for you as a counselor to help advocate for students. And I'm happy to explain in more detail if you have a question about anything on the screen. Okay, I actually have a specific high school in mind to give an example for what this question is asking. AP, dual enrollment, IB. So Ingram High School is a public high school in Seattle, Washington that offers AP courses, IB courses, and dual enrollment courses, right? And what's actually really wild about Ingram High School, and I don't necessarily recommend this, is that most of the students actually finish the IB diploma, if they're on that track, at the end of 11th grade. So they do it in 10th and 11th grade, as opposed to in most high schools, 11th and 12th grade is where students focus on the full International Baccalaureate diploma experience. So oftentimes at Ingram, the students have a kind of hodgepodge of AP courses as a senior for things that they didn't take as part of their diploma, and dual enrollment dual enrollment courses through a program called Running Start, which is common in a lot of Washington high schools. But that's an anomaly, right? So I would say reading, files from Ingram, I didn't necessarily, and other selective admissions officers would agree, I didn't necessarily have a huge preference for which advanced curricular route a student took. I'd say in general, the default tends to be that AP classes, if a school offers them, most of the times AP and IB are not always offered together, right? It's typically a school has either or, and maybe dual enrollment courses in conjunction with an IB option, but it really does vary so drastically, right? So in terms of preferences, I wouldn't really say there's a strong recommendation I would give to students other than focusing on core academic solid courses. So in the IB diploma, there's like business courses and courses that are, from the European system, which is a little more focused on planning for a trade or a career. It's being an IB diploma candidate, literally, it would be an easy read from a transcript standpoint because I would just look at the transcript and see the grades and that they were a diploma candidate. And I would write on my notes, diploma candidate, doing great, moving on. I didn't quite go into like the counting of which courses they were or things like that because the diploma, by doing the diploma, you're ensuring that already. It's built into the set standard of the curriculum. But with AP, I would be a lot more choosy and looking through when a student did certain courses, what grades they got, were they in core academic classes. So it is different when a student has 8 AP classes. That's great. Oh, one is environmental studies. 3 of them are art. They're not taking the AP bio, the AP chem, the physics that's offered in the school. I'm not saying necessarily that you have to have a student have taken all those courses. In general, taking more advanced courses beyond what a school has is a great route. But I'd say, again, prioritizing those core solid academic courses, the main subject that these colleges are preferring, is the best recommendation to give regardless of if it's AP, dual enrollment, or IB. So if for dual enrollment courses, this is an area where students are like, oh, it's a college class. I'm going to take, whatever, ultrasound, whatever. That's not necessarily at a highly selective school going to be the dual enrollment courses that they would prefer to see, just as they would typically prefer to see an AP Bio over an AP or an anatomy course for a student who's interested in medicine. They're still wanting and craving that high rigor advanced course, whatever the school offers.
Lovely. Um, there are different folks asking. I think I handled most of the questions around testing. Well, a thing that we sometimes get questions about, but don't often talk about is like tips for virtual homeschool students. When they're applying to these highly selective colleges. What would you say to folks who count
Yeah.
homeschoolers?
Yeah, so I worked with a homeschool student last year. She had a very interesting kind of hodgepodge of experiences. She started off in a brick and mortar school. Then she switched to an online high school. But then later on, she was doing a combination of that school, ad hoc classes, plus UC Scout classes, which is an online program that offers a range of courses that are A through G, University of California approved. Shout out to UC Scout. So with this student and family, they put together a really robust, basically it's like a leveled up school profile. So unlike a high school where you don't necessarily need to have like course descriptions for the courses that a student took, usually with homeschool students, because the curriculum can be so varied and not as standardized, it is helpful for an admissions officer to have lots of information about particular courses. So books that are included, texts that the student read, things along those lines. A little more granularity and detail, I'd say, is something that I would encourage you as an advocate for a homeschool student to build into your advocacy for the student on the recommendation letter and the school profile side. Testing, that's one where there's mixed opinions on this, and every college is going to view this differently. But in general, historically, the past couple of years or so, homeschool students are typically the population where some form of a standardized metric, whether that is AP scores or a standardized test score or some other metric that shows the material that they have been studying is there's a sense of academic viability and security on the admissions officer's end when they have evidence, because for a student coming from a regular high school, from a traditional high school, they'll have things like the percent of students who go on to four-year colleges. They'll have things like average, GPA markers, average test scores for a school district. Those are all things that even if a student applies test optional, the admissions officer has a more informed sense of the academic environment a student's coming from those data and metrics. So anything that you can fold in, it doesn't necessarily have to be a test score, but anything you can fold in that kind of gives that quantifiable security to someone in admissions of their academic preparation is going to be what I'd recommend.
There were a couple folks who were asking about, this is kind of related to selectives, but really related to all colleges, asking about the use of AI in college essays. And there's so much that we could say on this. There's probably a whole webinar, if not a whole course on this, so stay tuned. But I'll take this one and say, I think there are some ways to use AI, ChatGPT, for instance, to help students with the brainstorming process. And a simple way to do this is like they can take brainstorm materials, put it into ChatGPT, and ask it to generate, say, college essay ideas. That's one way to do it. Another thing that I really like is having, and I'm going very fast over stuff that we're talking about a lot more in a course that I'm teaching right now. That's not me trying to sell you a course. That's me just letting you know that I'm thinking about this a lot. Another thing that I really like is having, for example, AI help with research. When you're looking at a particular college and you're like, hey, I'm interested in Northwestern for student theater, give me some different links that would help me research, what are the opportunities that I could learn about at Northwestern. So it'll help, research in particular ways. It can also help ask students questions. So like, here's a, draft of my essay. What questions should I be thinking about as I'm doing this? And so those are all, I think, ethical uses. I think where it starts to get tricky, obviously, is when students are copying and pasting pieces of their essay into, into just using that for their Common App. But I'm advocating for caution with students because colleges it's such a new, it's a year and a half old, but it's still kind of new, and colleges are still, there's a range of how they feel about it. You've got some that are like, don't use it, we will find you. We will, rescind your application, as it happened in some cases. And then you've got Carlos from MIT who said on a webinar a few weeks ago, like, we love, ChatGPT, use it. We love technology. So it sort of depends. I would, again, definitely don't copy paste stuff, but there are some interesting, cool uses of it. And stay tuned. We'll share
Yeah.
more on that. when those-
Yeah, I mean, we actually touched on this for a decent amount during our recent podcast. So I don't know, Ethan, if you want to share the personal statement podcast. I think we talked maybe 10 minutes or so about varying colleges, use of AI, where it can be helpful for students in the brainstorming process. So yeah, if you're looking for a soundbite to send to students and families about it who are curious, or even just yourself, we have a video version of it too. So
We'll do a video version.
yeah,
Well, I'm going to cut us off because folks have things to do and lives to go lead. We love you all.
take the
We will
course.
see you soon.
It's great.
See you on the course. And if you've got, students or anything that you want to join the student version, it's coming up later this afternoon. The invite will be in your email. So much love. See y'all soon. Bye.
Thanks, y'all. Good luck.